The late Bronze Age, around 1200 BC. The world stands on the edge of collapse, great civilizations teeter, empires crumble, and somewhere on the windswept plains before the walls of Troy, the greatest warrior who ever lived prepares for battle. His name is Achilles, swift-footed, lion-hearted, terrible in his war cry, the first warrior of the Western world. But how did a young prince from the backwater kingdom of Thea in Greece become the deadliest fighter of his age? How did he master skills that would make him unstoppable on the battlefield? And what made him so feared that even today, over 3,000 years later, we still speak his name with reverence? This is the story of how Achilles became the deadliest warrior of the Bronze Age. To understand Achilles, we must first understand the world he lived in. The Bronze Age Mediterranean was a place of constant warfare, where kingdoms rose and fell with brutal efficiency. The Mycenaean Greeks, who would one day sail to Troy, had built a sophisticated military culture centered around heavily armored warriors, bronze weapons, and the new technology of war chariots. These were not the neat phalanxes of classical Greece. Bronze Age warfare was chaotic, personal, and utterly savage. Archaeological evidence from sites across Greece tells us about the weapons these warriors used. Spears were the primary killing tool, bronze-tipped, and designed for thrusting into an enemy's body. Swords came in various forms, from narrow rapiers meant to pierce armor gaps, to broader slashing blades that could cut through flesh and bone. The Mycenaeans wore armor that weighed up to 40 pounds, full suits of bronze plates like the famous Dendra panoply, which covered a warrior from neck to knees. They carried massive figure-eight shields made of layered bull hide, sometimes reinforced with bronze. On their heads, they wore helmets crafted from boar tusks, each helmet requiring the tusks of 20 to 40 boars. This was warfare as personal statement, where a warrior's equipment announced his status, his wealth, and his willingness to die for glory. But equipment alone did not make a warrior. The true measure of a Bronze Age fighter was his training, his skill, and his courage. And here, Achilles had an advantage that no other warrior could match. His teacher was Chiron the centaur. According to the myths passed down through generations, when Achilles was still a young boy, his father Peleus brought him to Mount Pelion. There, in the wild highlands of Thessaly, lived Chiron, the wisest of all the centaurs. Unlike his savage brothers who were known for drunkenness and violence, Chiron was learned, civilized, and possessed knowledge given to him by the gods themselves. Apollo had taught him medicine and music. Artemis had trained him in the hunt. From various deities he had learned prophecy, philosophy, and the arts of war. Chiron had already trained some of Greece's greatest heroes, Jason, who would lead the Argonauts, to capture the Golden Fleece, Asclepius, who would become the god of medicine, Hercules himself, the strongest man who ever lived. But Achilles would become Chiron's greatest student, the masterpiece of his teaching. The education Achilles received was comprehensive and brutal. Chiron did not simply teach him to fight, he taught him to survive, to think, to endure. The ancient sources tell us that Chiron fed young Achilles the innards of lions, the marrow of bears, the flesh of wild boars. This was not merely mythological flourish. It represented the idea that Achilles consumed the strength and ferocity of the most dangerous predators. He was being transformed from a soft prince into something wilder, more savage, more dangerous. Chiron made him stand in fast-flowing rivers, resisting the current until his legs were like iron. He made him chase swift animals through the mountains until he could run faster than any other man. He taught him to track prey through forests, to read signs in broken twigs and disturbed earth, to understand the patterns of animal behavior. These hunting skills translated directly to warfare. The patience to wait for the perfect moment to strike, the ability to read an opponent's movements, the instinct to know when to attack and when to retreat. But the physical training was only part of Chiron's instruction. He also taught Achilles music, making him learn the lyre. This was not mere cultural education. Music training developed fine motor control, pattern recognition, and the ability to maintain rhythm under pressure. These skills were essential for a warrior who needed to coordinate complex movements in the chaos of battle. More importantly, Chiron taught Achilles medicine. The young hero learned to identify healing herbs, to treat wounds, to understand human anatomy. He learned where the vital organs lay, which wounds were fatal and which were merely painful. This medical knowledge made him deadlier in combat. He knew exactly where to strike to kill a man quickly. He knew which armor gaps to exploit. He understood that a thrust to the throat severing the windpipe and major blood vessels would kill an enemy in seconds. Later, during the Trojan War, Achilles would teach these medical arts to his closest companion Patroclus, a detail that Homer includes in the Iliad. This was real knowledge, practical and deadly, passed from master to student across generations. Chiron also instructed Achilles in the specific weapons of Bronze Age warfare. Archery first. The bow was a hunter's weapon, but also a warrior's tool. Achilles learned to shoot with power and accuracy, to judge distance and wind to lead a moving target. Then came the spear, the primary weapon of Bronze Age combat. Chiron taught him to throw with devastating accuracy, and to fight with the spear in close combat, using it like a staff to block and strike before delivering the killing thrust. The sword required different skills. Bronze blades were shorter than later iron weapons, typically between 2 and 3 feet long. Achilles learned the rapier thrust, driving a narrow blade through gaps in armor, and the cutting stroke with broader blades, using momentum and edge alignment to slice through flesh. Most importantly, Chiron taught him to wrestle, to fight with his bare hands. Ancient Greek wrestling, pankration, was not a sport but a method of killing. Chokes, joint breaks, eye gouges. Achilles learned them all. This training would later prove essential. In his final duel with Hector, if weapons had failed, Achilles could have killed the Trojan prince with his hands alone. But perhaps the most important thing Chiron taught Achilles was something more subtle: combat psychology, the understanding of fear and courage, the ability to read an opponent's state of mind from his stance, his breathing, his eyes. Chiron taught Achilles that battles were won in the mind before they were won on the field. A warrior who projected absolute confidence could break an opponent's will before the first blow was struck. Achilles learned to cultivate that aura of invincibility. His war cry, famous in later legends, was not just noise. It was psychological warfare, a sound that froze men's hearts and made them think of death. The ancient sources emphasize that Achilles trained with Chiron for 9 years, from boyhood into young manhood. By the time he left Mount Pelion, he was no longer entirely human in his capabilities. He had been forged into something between a man and a god. His speed was legendary. Homer calls him swift-footed Achilles dozens of times in the Iliad. This was not poetic exaggeration. Bronze Age warfare rewarded speed. A warrior who could close distance quickly, strike, and withdraw before his opponent could react had an enormous advantage. Archaeological evidence suggests that Bronze Age warriors were smaller and lighter than modern soldiers, typically between 5 feet 6 and 5 feet 10 inches tall. But within that population, a man who was exceptionally fast and possessed superior reflexes would have been nearly unstoppable. Achilles could apparently outrun any other warrior at Troy. Only Ajax the Lesser was said to be close to his speed. This meant he could control the tempo of combat. He could engage when he wanted and disengage when he chose. He was never trapped, never forced into a position he did not choose. His strength was equally extraordinary. The sources describe him as godlike in build, tall and striking in appearance. He could wield weapons that other men found too heavy. His legendary spear, given to him by Chiron before he left for Troy, was said to be so massive that no other man at Troy could even lift it, much less fight with it. This weapon, called the Pelian Spear after Mount Pelion where Achilles trained, became one of his signatures. A thrust from that spear could drive through bronze armor. A strike could shatter shields. Later, Greek and Roman writers preserved the tradition that this spear had been made from an ash tree on Mount Pelion and was weighted and balanced specifically for Achilles' unique strength and fighting style. But physical gifts alone did not make Achilles the deadliest warrior of his age. Plenty of men were strong, many were fast. What set Achilles apart was his combat intelligence and his absolutely ruthless approach to warfare. Chiron had taught him to fight with cold calculation, not hot passion, to analyze opponents, identify weaknesses and exploit them without mercy. When Achilles went to war at Troy, he brought with him not just personal skill but also 50 ships filled with warriors. These were the Mermadons, the men of Achilles' kingdom in Thea. The name Mermadons means ant people, and ancient sources suggested they earned this name because they followed orders with the mindless efficiency of an ant colony. In reality, they were probably highly trained professional warriors, bound to Achilles by oath and personal loyalty. The Mycenaean world operated on a feudal system where local lords owed military service to greater kings. Achilles commanded his own force of elite troops who had trained together, fought together, and knew how to operate as a cohesive unit on the battlefield. This was rare in the Bronze Age. Most armies were collections of individual warriors who happened to be fighting on the same side. The Myrmidons were something different, a well-drilled force that could execute complex maneuvers. When Achilles led them into battle, they were devastating. Homer describes how the Myrmidons would form up around their leader, creating a mobile strike force that could punch through enemy lines and cause chaos in the Trojan rear. This tactical innovation gave Achilles another advantage. He was not just a great individual fighter, he was an effective military commander who understood how to use his troops to maximum effect. The Iliad makes clear that Achilles was responsible for sacking numerous cities around Troy during the 10-year siege. 23 cities by some accounts. These were not random raids. They were calculated campaigns to destroy Troy's allies, cut off their supply lines, and isolate the city. Achilles understood strategy as well as tactics. He knew that wars were not won by single combats alone, but by systematically breaking the enemy's ability to resist. When he attacked these cities, he was utterly without mercy. The male populations were slaughtered. The women were taken as slaves. The cities were burned. This was Bronze Age warfare at its most brutal. There were no rules of engagement, no conventions protecting civilians. When Achilles came to your city, you either defeated him or you died, and no one defeated him. At Troy itself, Achilles became the terror of the Trojan army. For 9 years he fought in the front lines, killing countless Trojan warriors. The sources mention specific kills. Troilus, one of Priam's sons, ambushed and murdered early in the war. Cycnus, who was supposedly invulnerable to weapons and whom Achilles strangled with his helmet strap. Dozens of named warriors from the Iliad alone. Each kill added to his reputation, made him more feared. By the time the Iliad begins in the 10th year of the war, Achilles' reputation was such that his mere presence on the battlefield could determine the outcome. When he fought, the Trojans were driven back. When he withdrew from combat after his quarrel with Agamemnon, the Trojans surged forward, nearly burning the Greek ships. This was not just a matter of Achilles' personal combat effectiveness, though that was considerable. It was also about morale and psychology. The Greeks fought with more courage when they knew Achilles was beside them. The Trojans fought with more caution when they knew he was hunting them. Then came the event that would define Achilles as the deadliest warrior of his age, the death of Patroclus. Patroclus was Achilles' closest companion, his dearest friend. Ancient sources suggest their bond may have been romantic, though interpretations vary. What is clear is that they were deeply devoted to each other. When Achilles withdrew from the fighting over the insult from Agamemnon, Patroclus could not bear to watch the Greeks suffer. He begged Achilles to let him enter the battle wearing Achilles' distinctive armour, leading the Myrmidons. Achilles agreed, but with strict instructions. Drive the Trojans from the ships, then return. Do not pursue them to Troy itself. Patroclus obeyed at first. He pushed the Trojans back, killing dozens. But then he lost control in the heat of battle. He pursued the retreating Trojans all the way to the walls of Troy. There, Apollo himself intervened. The god struck Patroclus, stunning him. Then Hector, Troy's greatest warrior, moved in and killed him. Hector stripped Achilles' armour from the corpse and put it on, claiming it as his prize. When Achilles learned that Patroclus was dead, something changed. The calculated warrior that Chiron had trained gave way to something primal and terrifying. Achilles' grief transformed into rage so intense that it alarmed even the gods. He had no armour, but he went to the Greek defensive trench and simply shouted. Homer describes his war cry as being so terrible that it panicked the Trojans and caused them to retreat in chaos. 12 Trojans died in the confusion, trampled by their own chariots or accidentally killed by their own spears. Just the sound of Achilles' voice had become a weapon. His mother Thetis, knowing he could not fight without armour, went to Hephaestus, the smith god, and commissioned new armour for her son. The armour Hephaestus created was described in loving detail in the Iliad, a full suit of bronze that was stronger and more beautiful than any mortal could make. When Achilles received it the next dawn, he armed himself and prepared to re-enter the battle. What followed was the Aristeia of Achilles, his greatest moment of glory, and it was soaked in blood. Achilles' return to the battlefield was apocalyptic. He did not just fight, he became death itself. Homer describes him killing so many Trojans that their bodies choked the Scamander River. The river god himself rose up to complain about the pollution of corpses. When Achilles fought the river god and survived, it was clear he had transcended normal mortal limits. He was fighting not just men but the forces of nature and prevailing. Trojan after Trojan fell to his spear. He killed Astropaeus, a famous warrior from distant Paeonia. He killed Hippodamas, Demoleon, Dardanus, Tros, Mulius, Achilles. The catalogue of his victims goes on for hundreds of lines in Homer's epic. Each death was described in brutal detail. Bronze spear points driving through teeth, exploding out the back of necks, heads split open by sword strokes, men cut in half at the waist. This was not heroic combat. This was systematic slaughter by a man who had become the perfect killing machine. The Trojans fled before him in absolute terror, retreating behind their city walls, all except one man, Hector. Hector knew he had to face Achilles. He was Troy's greatest warrior, the defender of the city. He had killed Patroclus. Honor demanded he stand and fight, but he also knew, everyone knew, that Achilles was superior. Hector's parents, King Priam and Queen Hecuba, begged him from the walls to come inside the city. But Hector stood firm, waiting for Achilles to arrive. When Achilles came, terrible in his new armor, Hector's courage failed. He ran. Achilles chased him 3 times around the walls of Troy. This was not a random pursuit. It was a deliberate psychological tactic. Achilles was showing everyone watching from the walls that their champion was afraid, that he could be hunted like an animal. He was breaking Trojan morale before he even struck a blow. Finally, with divine intervention from Athena who tricked Hector, the Trojan prince stopped running and turned to fight. The duel was brief and brutal. Hector threw his spear first. It struck Achilles' god-forged shield and bounced off harmlessly. Achilles threw his spear and missed, but Athena secretly returned it to his hand. When Hector reached for his second spear, it was not there. He realized he had been tricked by the gods. He drew his sword and charged. Achilles studied him coldly. He knew Hector was wearing his old armor, the armor Patroclus had been wearing when he died. Achilles knew every gap, every weakness in that armor because he had worn it for years. He identified the vulnerable spot at the base of the neck, just above the collarbone where armor plates met. As Hector charged, Achilles thrust his spear into that exact spot. The bronze point drove through Hector's throat, severing his windpipe but missing his voice, allowing him to speak final words. Hector fell, dying. He begged Achilles to return his body to his family for proper burial. Achilles refused. This was the lesson Chiron had taught taken to its darkest conclusion. Show no mercy. Make your enemies fear you so much that future enemies think twice before challenging you. Achilles tied Hector's ankles to his chariot and dragged the body around the walls of Troy in full view of Hector's family and all the Trojans. He dragged it around Patroclus's funeral pyre. For 12 days he dragged Hector's corpse around his camp each morning, desecrating it. The gods protected the body from decay, but the psychological damage to the Trojans was complete. Their greatest warrior had been killed, humiliated, denied burial rites. Achilles had sent a message. This is what happens to those who cross me. Finally, King Priam came to Achilles' tent in secret, guided by the god Hermes. The old king begged for his son's body, offering a massive ransom. In one of the most moving scenes in the Iliad, Achilles finally showed mercy. He saw in Priam a reflection of his own father Peleus, old and grieving. He accepted the ransom and returned Hector's body, granting a truce for the funeral. But by then, the damage was done. Achilles had proven himself not just the best warrior, but the most feared. Even in his moment of compassion, he was in complete control. Priam had come to him as a supplicant, acknowledging Achilles' power over life and death. What made Achilles the deadliest warrior of the Bronze Age? It was not just his physical gifts, though those were extraordinary. It was not just his training under Chiron, though that gave him unparalleled skill. It was the combination of physical ability, technical mastery, tactical intelligence, and absolutely ruthless psychology. Achilles understood that warfare was not just about killing enemies, but about breaking their will to fight. He cultivated his reputation carefully. His distinctive armor, his unique spear that no one else could wield, his famous war cry. These were tools of psychological warfare. When Trojans faced Achilles, they were already half defeated by their own fear. He was also adaptable. Bronze Age warfare was chaotic and unpredictable. Weapons broke, formations collapsed. The best-laid battle plans fell apart. Achilles could switch seamlessly from fighting with a spear to a sword to his bare hands. He could fight as part of a formation with the Myrmidons or alone against multiple opponents. He could command troops in complex maneuvers or simply charge straight into enemy lines and trust his skills to see him through. Archaeological evidence gives us some context for understanding just how skilled Achilles must have been. Bronze Age combat was intensely physical. Warriors wore armour that weighed up to 40 pounds. They carried shields that weighed 10 to 20 pounds. They fought in the Mediterranean heat, often for hours. Simply maintaining combat effectiveness under those conditions required extraordinary conditioning. Achilles did not just maintain effectiveness, he excelled. He could fight all day, killing opponent after opponent without tiring. His speed allowed him to strike multiple times before his enemies could react once. His strength let him wield weapons that were too heavy for normal men, giving him longer reach and more striking power. Bronze weapons required skill to use effectively. Bronze is softer than iron or steel. It can chip or bend if it strikes hard objects at the wrong angle. Achilles had to know exactly how to strike, where to strike, to maximize damage while preserving his weapons. He needed backup weapons and the skills to use them all. The sources mention his sword, his spear, his bow, his bare hands. Each weapon system required years of training to master. Achilles had mastered them all. The armour of the Bronze Age was designed to stop slashing strikes and glancing blows, but a skilled warrior could defeat armour by striking gaps, by using thrusting weapons that could slip between plates, or by striking with such force that armour plates crumpled or bronze bent. Achilles knew human anatomy from his medical training. He knew where the gaps were. He could see an enemy's armour configuration at a glance and identify the killing zones: the throat, the armpit, the groin, the inside of the thigh where major blood vessels ran close to the surface. One thrust in the right place and a man died in seconds, regardless of how much bronze he wore. Achilles also understood combat ranges and initiative. Most Bronze Age warriors fought at spear range, about 7 to 8 feet. At that distance, you could strike, but your opponent could also strike you. Skilled fighters learned to control the engagement distance, staying just out of their opponent's reach while remaining close enough to strike. Achilles' speed gave him a crucial advantage. He could close distance faster than enemies could retreat. He could open distance faster than they could pursue. He controlled the range, which meant he controlled the fight. Single combat was common in Bronze Age warfare, both as formal duels and as chance encounters on the battlefield. A warrior who lost a duel did not just die. His entire side's morale suffered. His comrades saw that their champion could be defeated. The enemy's morale soared. This meant that great warriors like Achilles had an impact far beyond their individual combat effectiveness. When Achilles killed Trojan champions, he was not just removing one enemy soldier, he was demoralizing hundreds. The Iliad preserves the memory of some of Achilles' other duels and combats. He fought Aeneas, the Trojan hero who would later found Rome according to legend, and would have killed him if the gods had not intervened to save Aeneas for his greater destiny. He fought Asclepius, who fought with 2 spears simultaneously, an unusual and dangerous technique, and killed him despite being wounded himself. He fought Memnon, king of the Ethiopians, another son of a goddess, and killed him in single combat. Each of these victories added to his legend, but Achilles' deadliness was not just about individual combat. He was also a strategic thinker who understood how battles fit into campaigns. The 23 cities he sacked around Troy were not random targets. They were Troy's allies and supply sources. By destroying them, Achilles was strangling Troy economically and diplomatically. Each destroyed city was one less source of reinforcements, one less place Troy could turn for food and weapons. When those cities' warriors came to Troy's defense, Achilles killed them too, adding to the piles of corpses that testified to his prowess. The Greeks at Troy had other great warriors. Ajax the Great, massive and immovable with his tower shield; Diomedes, who wounded gods themselves in combat; Odysseus, cunning and dangerous. But none of them were spoken of with the same fear and awe as Achilles. Why? Because Achilles combined qualities that the others possessed individually. He was as strong as Ajax, as clever as Odysseus, as fierce as Diomedes. But more than that, he had transcended ordinary human limits through his training and his divine heritage. His mother Thetis was a goddess, one of the Nereids, sea nymphs. This gave Achilles literal divine blood. Whether we believe in the mythology or interpret it as a way of saying his genetic inheritance was exceptional, the result was the same. He was faster, stronger, and more resilient than normal humans. Some later traditions claimed Thetis had tried to make him immortal by dipping him in the river Styx, and that only his heel, where she held him, remained vulnerable. The historical Achilles probably did not have this specific invulnerability. But the legend captures something true. On the battlefield, Achilles seemed invincible. He fought in the front lines for 9 years at Troy and was never seriously wounded in combat. He took risks that should have killed him and emerged unscathed. He challenged the greatest enemy warriors and killed them all. To his enemies, he must have seemed supernatural. How do you fight something that cannot be hurt, that kills with perfect precision, that never tires, never falters, never shows mercy? The answer, as the Trojans learned, was that you could not fight Achilles and win. Your only hope was to avoid him, to not be on the battlefield when he was there, to retreat behind walls and pray he would not come for you. But eventually he would come, and when he did, you died. This is what made Achilles the deadliest warrior of the Bronze Age. Not just that he could kill skillfully, though he could, not just that he was brave, though he was, but that he was inevitable. Once Achilles marked you for death, you were already dead. You just did not know it yet. The story of how Achilles himself died is telling. According to the sources, he was killed by Paris, Hector's younger brother, the prince whose abduction of Helen had started the entire war. Paris was not a great warrior. He was an archer, which Greeks considered somewhat less honourable. Then, fighting hand to hand, he shot Achilles with an arrow, and that arrow struck Achilles' heel, the one vulnerable spot. Some versions say the arrow was guided by Apollo himself, but consider what this means. The only way to kill Achilles was with a missile weapon from a distance, striking the one tiny vulnerable spot on his body, and even then requiring divine aid. Face to face, with weapons in hand, Achilles could not be beaten. That was the reality of the deadliest warrior of the Bronze Age. After Achilles died, the Greeks fought over his body, desperate to prevent the Trojans from desecrating it, as Achilles had desecrated Hector's. Ajax and Odysseus held off the entire Trojan army to rescue Achilles' corpse. His armour was awarded to Odysseus, which drove Ajax mad with grief and rage. The Greeks gave Achilles a funeral worthy of the greatest warrior who ever lived. His bones were mixed with those of Patroclus and placed in a golden urn. A massive burial mound was raised over them, visible from far out at sea. That mound became a place of pilgrimage. Centuries later, Alexander the Great would visit it before his own campaigns of conquest. Alexander saw himself as a new Achilles, a warrior who would change the world through martial prowess. He slept with a copy of the Iliad under his pillow and strove to emulate Achilles' glory. The historical reality of Achilles is debatable. We do not know if there was a real warrior named Achilles who fought at Troy. The archaeological evidence confirms there was a major war or series of wars in the region around 1200 BC, coinciding with the late Bronze Age collapse. The city that Homer called Troy, known archaeologically as Troy 7a, shows signs of violent destruction from that period. But whether Achilles himself was real, or a composite of multiple warriors or entirely legendary, his story preserves real information about Bronze Age combat. The weapons described in the Iliad are accurate to Bronze Age archaeology. The armour types match what we have found in excavations. The tactics described, the importance of champions, the role of chariots, the emphasis on hand-to-hand combat, all of this reflects real Bronze Age warfare. Homer was composing his epic around 700 BC, 500 years after the Trojan War supposedly took place, yet he preserved accurate details about weapons and armour that had not been used for centuries. This suggests he was working from older sources, oral traditions that went back to the Bronze Age itself. Those traditions remembered Achilles as the greatest warrior of that age. Whether he was real or not, he represents an ideal of martial excellence that Bronze Age cultures valued. The perfect warrior was not just strong and brave, he was trained from childhood in multiple forms of combat. He understood tactics and strategy. He could lead men in battle. He possessed not just physical courage, but also the psychological strength to kill without hesitation and the discipline to control his rage when necessary. Achilles had all of these qualities. His training under Chiron gave him technical mastery of weapons and hand-to-hand combat. His divine heritage, whether literal or genetic, gave him physical advantages. His experience in 9 years of war gave him battlefield wisdom. His command of the Myrmidons demonstrated leadership, and his capacity for controlled violence, his ability to become death itself when he chose, made him truly unstoppable. The Bronze Age world produced many great warriors: Hector of Troy, who held the Greek army at bay; Ajax the Great, who stood like a tower of strength; Diomedes, who wounded gods. But Achilles stood above them all. His combination of speed, strength, skill, intelligence, and ruthlessness was unmatched. He was the weapon that Chiron had forged over 9 years of brutal training on Mount Pelion. He was the warrior his mother Thetis had tried to protect but could not save from his chosen destiny. He was the hero whose name became synonymous with martial excellence for all of Western civilization. 3,000 years after his death, real or legendary, we still speak of Achilles. We use his name in our language, the Achilles tendon, the Achilles heel, meaning vulnerability and strength. We still read Homer's Iliad and marvel at the descriptions of his prowess in battle. We still debate whether his rage was justified, whether his treatment of Hector's body was honourable, whether his choice of glory over long life was wise. But we do not debate whether he was the deadliest warrior of his age, because the tradition is unanimous on that point. In the Bronze Age world, when warriors fought with bronze weapons and wooden shields, when battles were decided by individual champions as much as by army movements, when a great warrior could change the course of history, Achilles was supreme. He was what every warrior aspired to be, and what every enemy feared to face. His deadliness came from multiple sources working together. Physical gifts that placed him at the top of human possibility. Training that was comprehensive, brutal, and designed to create the perfect killer. Experience accumulated over years of constant warfare. Psychological understanding that let him break opponents mentally before physical combat began. Tactical and strategic intelligence that made him dangerous not just in duels but in campaigns, and perhaps most importantly the absolute ruthless will to do whatever was necessary to win. That last quality is often overlooked, but it was crucial. Many warriors were skilled, many were brave, but Achilles was willing to cross lines that others would not. When he needed to terrify his enemies, he did. When he needed to desecrate a corpse to make a point, he did. When he needed to slaughter entire cities to achieve his objectives, he did. This made him not just deadly, but terrifying. His enemies knew he would stop at nothing. There were no limits to what Achilles would do to achieve victory. This psychological edge multiplied his physical advantages. In the Bronze Age Mediterranean, warfare was the ultimate test of manhood and civilization. Kingdoms that could not defend themselves were destroyed. Warriors who could not fight effectively were killed. The evolutionary pressure on military effectiveness was intense. In that environment, Achilles represented the apex of what was possible. He was not just a good warrior or even a great one. He was the best that humanity could produce with the tools and knowledge available in that era. He was the deadliest warrior of the Bronze Age because no one else combined all of his advantages. Others might match him in one area. None matched him in all areas. And in the desperate struggle for survival that characterized Bronze Age warfare, that combination of advantages made all the difference. When Achilles entered the battlefield, the outcome was decided. His side would win, his enemies would die. It was that simple. That is what Deadliest means. Not just capable of killing, but so far above all others in that capability that comparison becomes meaningless. Modern military historians studying Bronze Age warfare have tried to quantify what made warriors effective. Training mattered, equipment mattered, physical conditioning mattered, but what mattered most was the combination of skills and the psychological factors. A warrior who could maintain aggression while remaining calm under pressure, who could read opponents and adapt instantly, who could lead while also fighting effectively, that warrior was far more valuable than 10 ordinary soldiers. Achilles was that warrior multiplied. He could do everything the ideal warrior could do, but better. Faster decisions, more accurate strikes, greater endurance, superior tactical awareness, complete psychological control. The sources describe him remaining calm even in the midst of chaotic battle, picking his targets, executing them methodically, then moving to the next. This was not berserker rage, despite how his anger after Patroclus' death is often portrayed. Even in his fury, Achilles fought with precision and control. He used his rage to fuel his aggression, but did not let it compromise his effectiveness. This discipline, this ability to harness emotion without being controlled by it, was another lesson from Chiron. The wise centaur had taught Achilles that effective violence required a clear mind. The contrast with other warriors in the Iliad is instructive. Ajax fought with raw strength and courage but lacked Achilles' speed and adaptability. Diomedes was fierce and skilled, but did not have Achilles' strategic sense. Odysseus was clever and dangerous but not as physically dominant. Hector was brave and noble, but ultimately not skilled enough to match Achilles. Each had their strengths. None had all the strengths that Achilles possessed. This is why, when the question is asked who was the deadliest warrior of the bronze age, there is only one answer: Achilles. Swift-footed, lion-hearted, terrible in his war cry, trained by the wisest teacher, equipped with weapons that no other man could wield, leading troops that followed him with absolute loyalty, feared by his enemies to the point that his name alone could cause panic, and possessed of skills so refined, so comprehensive, so devastating, that he stood alone at the apex of Bronze Age martial prowess. The young prince who went to Mount Pelion to train with Chiron had been transformed into something more than human. Not a god, but perhaps the closest thing to one that walked the earth in mortal form. The deadliest warrior of the Bronze Age, the first warrior of the Western world, Achilles. And yet, the question remains: what specific techniques and methods did Achilles employ that made him so uniquely deadly? To understand this, we must look deeper into the mechanics of Bronze Age combat, and how Achilles mastered every aspect of it. The foundation of Achilles' deadliness was his understanding of biomechanics and leverage. Bronze Age combat was not about wild swinging or brute force alone. It was about understanding how the human body moves, where it is strong, where it is weak, and how to exploit those weaknesses with minimal effort. Chiron had taught Achilles the principles that modern martial artists would recognize instantly. Use an opponent's momentum against him, attack when he is off balance, strike at angles that prevent effective defense. These principles were not written in manuals in the Bronze Age. They were passed down through oral tradition and practical demonstration. Achilles had absorbed them so completely that they became instinctive. When he fought, he did not think about technique. His body simply responded with optimal efficiency. Consider the mechanics of spear fighting, which was the core of Bronze Age combat. A spear is essentially a lever. The longer the lever, the more force you can generate at the point, but a longer lever is also harder to control and slower to maneuver. Achilles' spear was famously massive, longer and heavier than any other warrior's weapon. Most men would have been slowed by such a weapon, unable to move it quickly enough to defend against faster attacks. But Achilles had trained with progressively heavier weapons from childhood. His muscles, tendons, and neural pathways had adapted to handle extreme loads. He could move his massive spear as quickly as other men moved normal spears, which meant he generated far more kinetic energy with each strike. When that heavy spear point, driven by Achilles' strength and the mechanical advantage of the long shaft, hit an enemy, it did not just penetrate, it destroyed. Armor crumpled, bones shattered. Men were literally blown backward by the impact. The archaeological record shows us Bronze Age spear wounds, puncture marks in bones, often with radiating fractures from the impact force. Achilles' spear would have caused catastrophic damage. But the spear was just one weapon in his arsenal. When space became too tight for spear work, or when his spear was lost or broken, Achilles transitioned seamlessly to his sword. Bronze Age swords came in several types, and a truly skilled warrior would have trained with all of them. The rapier style, with a narrow blade up to 3 feet long, was designed for thrusting. It could slip through armor gaps, between ribs, into throats and eye sockets. Achilles knew human anatomy. He knew that a thrust angled upward under the ribcage could pierce the heart or lungs. A thrust to the throat severed the carotid arteries and windpipe, causing death in seconds through blood loss and suffocation. These were not random attacks. They were surgical strikes targeting specific anatomical vulnerabilities. The broader slashing swords required different techniques. Bronze is softer than steel, and will not hold an edge as well. A slashing attack had to be executed with proper edge alignment, striking at the correct angle to cut rather than bludgeon. Achilles had practiced these cuts tens of thousands of times. He knew instinctively how to orient his blade, how much force to use, where on the enemy's body to target for maximum effect. The shield was equally important in Bronze Age warfare. The massive figure-8 shields, or the later round shields, were not just defensive tools, they were weapons in their own right. Achilles would have learned shield punches, using the rim or boss to strike an opponent's face or body, stunning them and creating openings for lethal attacks. He learned to use the shield to bind an enemy's weapon, trapping their spear or sword against the shield's surface while he struck with his own weapon. He learned to angle his shield to deflect incoming strikes rather than absorbing their full force, conserving his strength over long engagements. Most importantly, he learned to read an opponent's shield positioning. A shield held too high left the legs vulnerable, too low exposed the head, too far left or right opened angles of attack. Achilles could see these openings instantly and exploit them before his opponent could react. This visual processing speed, this ability to recognize patterns and respond in fractions of a second, was perhaps his greatest advantage. While other warriors were still processing what they saw, Achilles had already struck. The wrestling and grappling skills Chiron taught were critical for situations where weapons failed or close quarters prevented their use. Bronze Age wrestling, or pankration as later Greeks would formalize it, was brutal. There were no rules, no referee, no tapping out. You fought until your opponent was unconscious, crippled, or dead. Achilles learned chokes that could render a man unconscious in seconds by cutting off blood flow to the brain. He learned joint locks that could break elbows, shoulders, knees. He learned throws that could slam an opponent's head into rocks or the ground with lethal force. He learned eye gouges, throat strikes, groin attacks. These were not sporting techniques. They were methods of killing when you had no other option. On the chaotic battlefield, warriors often ended up grappling after losing their weapons. A warrior who could not fight effectively at grappling range was at a severe disadvantage. Achilles had no such weakness. He was as deadly barehanded as he was with weapons. His physical conditioning was extraordinary even by modern standards. We know from ancient sources that Achilles could fight all day without tiring. This was not poetic exaggeration. It was the result of brutal conditioning that started in childhood. Running up mountains with Chiron, chasing wild animals for miles, fighting for hours with weighted training weapons. His cardiovascular system was supremely developed. His muscles had extraordinary endurance. His pain tolerance was probably far higher than normal men due to years of exposure to discomfort and injury during training. Modern studies of elite athletes show that much of performance is determined by the body's ability to process oxygen, clear lactic acid from muscles, and maintain blood glucose levels. Achilles would have naturally had some genetic advantages in these areas, the divine blood that myths attributed to his goddess mother. But he also trained these systems relentlessly. The result was a warrior who could maintain peak performance while his opponents flagged. In a long battle, this meant Achilles was fighting fresh troops while he remained dangerous. He could outlast anyone. The psychological dimension of his deadliness cannot be overstated. Achilles understood that most fights are won before the first blow. If you can make your opponent doubt himself, make him afraid, make him hesitate, you have already won. Achilles cultivated an aura of invincibility through carefully managed reputation. His distinctive appearance on the battlefield, his unique weapons, his famous war cry. All of these served to announce his presence and strike fear. When Trojan warriors saw Achilles approaching, they had already heard the stories. They knew he had killed dozens of their best fighters. They knew he had sacked 23 cities. They knew he had dragged Hector's body around the walls. This knowledge created doubt. Maybe I cannot beat him. Maybe I should run. Maybe I am about to die. That moment of doubt, that fraction of a second of hesitation, was all Achilles needed. While his opponent was thinking, Achilles was already moving, already striking, already killing. He also understood the power of controlled aggression. Too much emotion in combat leads to mistakes. Berserker rage might create initial shock, but it also blinds you to danger and causes you to waste energy. Too little emotion makes you hesitant, slow to commit to attacks. Achilles had learned to maintain a state of heightened aggression without losing control. He was always on the edge of violence, ready to explode into action, but his mind remained clear. He could assess the battlefield, identify threats and opportunities, make tactical decisions, all while maintaining the aggressive momentum that kept his enemies defensive. This mental state, which modern combat psychology recognizes as crucial for elite fighters, was something Chiron had trained into Achilles through years of practice. Stay calm in your core while your surface burns with controlled fury. The role of experience in making Achilles deadly should not be underestimated. By the time the events of the Iliad occur in the 10th year of the Trojan War, Achilles had been in combat constantly for 9 years. He had fought hundreds of battles, killed hundreds of men, faced every possible combat situation. He had learned lessons that cannot be taught, only experienced: the feel of a spear penetrating flesh, the sound of bones breaking, the exact amount of force needed to drive a sword through different types of armor, how to read subtle body language that telegraphs an opponent's next move, when to press an attack and when to withdraw. These lessons were written in blood, learned through trial and error, refined through constant repetition. Every combat encounter added to his database of experience. By the 10th year, Achilles had seen everything and developed responses to everything. There were no surprises left that could catch him off guard. His tactical intelligence extended beyond individual combat to understanding battlefield dynamics. Achilles knew how to use terrain. He knew that fighting uphill gave advantages in reach and momentum. He knew that loose sand or mud could trap feet and slow movement. He knew that sunlight could blind opponents if he positioned correctly. He knew wind direction mattered for throwing spears. These environmental factors, which many warriors ignored in the heat of battle, were tools Achilles used to maximize his effectiveness. He also understood unit tactics and how to coordinate with his Myrmidons. When leading his men, Achilles would position himself at the critical point, the place where the enemy line was strongest or where a breakthrough would be most devastating. His men knew to support him, to guard his flanks, to exploit the gaps his attacks created. This made the Myrmidons far more effective than their numbers suggested. They were not just following Achilles, they were functioning as a coordinated weapon system with Achilles as the point. The concept of economy of motion was central to Achilles' fighting style. Wasted movement meant wasted energy. Every strike, every block, every step had to be purposeful and efficient. Chiron had drilled this into him. Do not make 2 movements when one will suffice. Do not use excessive force when minimal force will kill. Do not move your whole body when moving your arm is enough. This efficiency allowed Achilles to fight longer than his opponents, and to move faster because he eliminated unnecessary motion. Modern martial artists spend years trying to achieve this efficiency. Achilles had it ingrained from childhood. When he struck, there was no telegraphing, no winding up, no wasted motion. His attacks came from positions that looked neutral, exploding into action without warning. His opponents literally could not see the attacks coming until it was too late to defend. Range management was another critical skill. Every weapon has an optimal range. Too close, and you cannot use it effectively. Too far, and you cannot reach your target. Achilles was a master of maintaining optimal range for his weapons, while staying outside his opponent's optimal range. With his longer spear, he could strike enemies who could not reach him. When they tried to close distance, his superior footwork allowed him to circle away, maintaining his advantage. When he chose to close range, perhaps to use his sword or grappling skills, he could do so explosively, covering distance faster than opponents expected. This control of distance meant Achilles was always fighting on his terms. His opponents were constantly trying to get into position to attack effectively, while he was always in position. The relationship between Achilles and his equipment was symbiotic. His weapons were not just tools but extensions of his body. He had trained with his spear for so long that he knew its balance point, its weight, its reach to the inch. He could throw it accurately at moving targets 30 yards away. He could thrust it with precision into gaps measured in inches. He could use it to block incoming attacks, using the shaft to deflect enemy weapons. His sword was equally familiar. He knew exactly how it would behave, how the bronze would flex under stress, where the blade was strongest and where it was more vulnerable to damage. This intimate knowledge of his equipment meant he could push both weapons and armor to their absolute limits without failure. He knew how much abuse they could take and when they needed to be replaced or repaired. Achilles also understood the importance of intimidation through demonstrated capability. Early in any campaign or battle, he would make devastating displays of his power, killing an enemy champion quickly and brutally, throwing his spear completely through an armored opponent. Moving so fast that he seemed to be in two places at once, these demonstrations were calculated. They served to demoralize the enemy while simultaneously boosting his own side's confidence. After witnessing Achilles effortlessly destroy a renowned enemy warrior, opposing soldiers became reluctant to face him. Meanwhile, Greek soldiers fought more bravely knowing Achilles was with them. This psychological force multiplication meant Achilles' impact on battles was far greater than just the enemies he personally killed. His mere presence altered the behavior of hundreds of warriors on both sides. The concept of the combat loop, which modern military theory recognizes as observe, orient, decide, act, was something Achilles executed faster than anyone else. By the time an opponent observed Achilles and began to orient their response, Achilles had already decided on his action and executed it. This speed of decision-making came from pattern recognition built through thousands of hours of training and combat. Achilles did not need to consciously analyze what he saw. His subconscious mind recognized patterns instantly and triggered appropriate responses. This is what people mean when they talk about muscle memory or fighting instinct. It is not really memory or instinct. It is the result of neural pathways being reinforced through repetition until responses become automatic. Achilles had the most refined and extensive combat neural pathways of any warrior in his world. His ability to read opponents was almost supernatural in its accuracy. Within seconds of engaging an enemy, Achilles could assess their skill level, identify their habits and weaknesses, and formulate a plan to kill them. He noticed tiny details. How an opponent held their shield indicated whether they were right or left-handed, and which side they favoured for defence. How they moved their feet showed whether they had formal training or were self-taught. How they gripped their weapon revealed their confidence level. Their breathing patterns indicated their stamina and stress level. All of this information, processed in fractions of a second, gave Achilles a complete tactical picture of his opponent. He knew where they were weak before he ever struck a blow. This ability to read opponents came from Chiron's training and observation, and from years of combat experience, but it also required natural intelligence and processing speed that few humans possess. The concept of commitment in combat was another area where Achilles excelled. Many warriors, even skilled ones, fight hesitantly. They probe, they feint, they test their opponent before fully committing to an attack. This caution comes from fear of injury or death. It is a survival instinct. But it also creates opportunities for opponents to defend or counterattack. Achilles had transcended this hesitancy. When he decided to strike, he committed fully. His attacks came with complete confidence and overwhelming force. There were no half measures, no tentative probes. This total commitment meant his attacks were devastatingly effective. It also created psychological pressure on opponents. They faced a warrior who came at them with absolute certainty and conviction. This can break an opponent's will, even if they have adequate skill to defend. They begin to doubt themselves because they are facing someone who has no doubt. The physical tools Achilles possessed gave him advantages, but it was how he used those tools that made him transcendent. Strength without skill is just clumsiness. Speed without control is just flailing. Courage without intelligence is just stupidity. Achilles had the complete package. Every physical attribute enhanced by perfect technique and tactical intelligence. Every decision made with complete confidence based on superior experience and pattern recognition. Every movement economical and purposeful. Every attack committed and devastating. This is what made him not just good or great, but utterly supreme. He represented the absolute peak of what was possible for a human warrior in the Bronze Age. When we examine the specific kills attributed to Achilles in the sources, we can see patterns in his methods. He frequently killed opponents with single strikes to vital areas, throats, heads, hearts. He did not waste time with multiple wounds. He identified the killing blow and delivered it immediately. This efficiency was partly about conserving energy for long battles, but also about ensuring kills. A wounded enemy might still be dangerous. A dead enemy was not a threat. Achilles' medical knowledge from Chiron meant he knew exactly where and how to strike to cause immediate death. The other pattern in his kills was the variety of methods. He killed with spear thrusts, sword cuts, thrown spears, even with rocks on at least one occasion. This versatility meant he could adapt to any situation. If one weapon was unavailable, he had others. If all weapons failed, he had his hands. There was no scenario in which Achilles was helpless. His recovery ability was also extraordinary. In the few instances where Achilles was wounded in combat, he recovered quickly and continued fighting. This was partly due to his robust constitution and partly due to his medical knowledge. He knew how to assess whether a wound was serious or superficial. He knew basic field treatment to stop bleeding and prevent infection. He knew which plants and herbs could dull pain or promote healing. This knowledge kept him in the fight when other warriors would have been disabled. It also contributed to his reputation for invulnerability. Enemies who wounded him and thought they had gained an advantage would find him still fighting at full capacity moments later. This was psychologically devastating. How do you defeat someone who cannot be hurt? The relationship between Achilles and his armour deserves examination. The armour Hephaestus made for him after Patroclus died was described in extraordinary detail in the Iliad. Shield, breastplate, helmet, greaves. Each piece was decorated with scenes of life and war, making the armour both functional and beautiful. But beyond the divine craftsmanship, what made the armour significant was how well it fit Achilles and his fighting style. It was strong enough to stop weapons, but not so heavy that it restricted movement. It covered vital areas while leaving joints and limbs mobile. It was balanced so that wearing it did not cause fatigue. Achilles had trained in armour from childhood, so he was completely accustomed to fighting while encumbered. Many warriors struggled with armour, finding it restrictive or exhausting. For Achilles, armour was just part of his body. He moved in full armour as fluidly as other men moved without it. This meant he had all the protection armour provided without any of the usual disadvantages. The mental discipline required to maintain peak performance in combat cannot be overstated. Battle is chaos, noise, confusion, fear, pain, exhaustion. Most warriors operate at a fraction of their training capacity because the stress of combat degrades their performance. The body's fight-or-flight response floods the system with adrenaline, which increases strength and pain tolerance, but also causes tunnel vision, auditory exclusion, and loss of fine motor control. Achilles had trained under stress so extensively that he could maintain calm focus even in the midst of the most chaotic battle. He did not experience the tunnel vision that caused other warriors to miss threats. He did not lose fine motor control, which allowed him to execute precise techniques. He did not freeze or panic when surprised. This stress inoculation, which modern military training tries to replicate, was ingrained in Achilles through years of training with Chiron. He had been exposed to so much controlled stress during training that actual combat stress did not degrade his performance. The concept of initiative in combat favoured Achilles overwhelmingly. In any fight, one person is acting and the other is reacting. The person with initiative, who is attacking and forcing responses, has a significant advantage. The person reacting is always a step behind, always responding to threats rather than creating them. Achilles seized initiative immediately in every engagement and never surrendered it. His attacks came in relentless waves, giving opponents no time to mount their own offence. They were always defending, always retreating, always trying to survive rather than win. This offensive dominance came from his superior speed and conditioning. He could attack continuously, while his opponents needed to pause to catch their breath or reset their position. Those pauses were when Achilles struck hardest, exploiting the momentary weakness. His understanding of timing was perfect. In combat, milliseconds matter. Striking a tenth of a second too early or too late can mean the difference between a hit and a miss, between killing and being killed. Achilles had developed timing precision through endless repetition. He knew exactly when an opponent would be vulnerable based on their movements. He knew when they would be off balance, when their shield would be out of position, when they would be unable to defend. He could see these moments coming before they arrived and position himself to exploit them. This predictive ability, based on pattern recognition and experience, made him seem clairvoyant to opponents. They felt like Achilles knew what they were going to do before they did it. In a sense, he did. Their body language and positioning telegraphed their intentions to someone with his level of experience. The role of anger in Achilles' effectiveness is complex. After Patroclus died, Achilles fought with a rage that terrified everyone. But this was not blind rage. It was focused fury. The anger gave him relentless aggression and complete disregard for his own safety, but his technical skills remained intact. He did not make mistakes. He did not fight recklessly. He simply fought with such intensity and persistence that no one could stand against him. This ability to harness emotion as fuel while maintaining control is rare. Most people lose control when angry. Achilles channeled his rage into perfect violence. This may have been the ultimate expression of Chiron's teaching. Emotion is a tool. Use it, but do not let it use you. When we consider what made Achilles the deadliest warrior of the Bronze Age, we must acknowledge it was not one thing but many things working together synergistically. His physical gifts multiplied his technical skill. His technical skill multiplied his tactical intelligence. His tactical intelligence multiplied his psychological impact. His psychological impact multiplied his physical effectiveness. Each element reinforced the others, creating a warrior whose total capability far exceeded the sum of his individual advantages. This synergy is what separated Achilles from other great warriors. They might match him in 1 or 2 dimensions. No one matched him in all dimensions simultaneously. And that complete mastery across every aspect of combat is what made him not just deadly, but uniquely, supremely, historically deadly. The deadliest warrior of the Bronze Age, the standard against which all other warriors were measured and found wanting, Achilles.